So shifting the focus in this way draws attention to the difference between a company's legal permit and the social acceptance that is essential for companies to be able to survive, prosper, and ultimately be part of communities that advocate for and support their interests. And that's called social licence to operate. It's the idea of stakeholder perception of the legitimacy of the company. So we've seen how the Royal Commission has dented the social acceptance of the financial services sector, and there's been an attendant hit to shareholder value. We've seen trust in business decline to an all-time low. And in the 21st century, it's really considered now that the relationship between business and society is an implicit social contract. And proponents of corporate responsibility note that social issues are not tangential to the business of business, but fundamental to it. And I was struck by something that Dr. Ken Henry, chairman of NAB, said at the Australian Shareholders Association National Conference this year, when he commented that directors demonstrate through their decisions an appreciation of and responsiveness to the societal context within which the company operates. We're all in it together, he said. So today we're exploring what it means for us all to be in it together, and how business leaders can set their companies on the path to regaining trust. And we're going to look at that idea of profit and purpose. Are they in conflict? Are they aligned? What does that mean when you get down to the actual actions and behaviours within companies? So I'm going to start off talking to the panellists and asking them about something that has been talked about in the business community for a while, which is called enlightened self-interest, which mean that business leaders see considerable incentives for companies to conduct their business in a socially and environmentally acceptable manner. But of course, enlightened self-interest still means that they're just thinking about themselves first. So can we explore, is that a good enough reason, or should we be looking at something more than that? And I'm going to start with you, Leona.
Yeah, I think you... Am I working? No? Hey, Nina. I think you hit the nail on the head saying self-interest is self-interest, whether it's enlightened or otherwise. So, and I mean, if we just look at the whole premise of enlightened self-interest, it is about doing well by doing good. But it is a good thing to aspire to, I think, individually, but at an organisation and at a corporate level, I think it's really one-dimensional. And if you take a step back and ensure that the interest is actually a collective interest, which covers all stakeholders, which, as Manish was saying before, will take you down a purpose-led path. Will ensure that you're extremely clear of why you exist as an organisation and how that creates value for all stakeholders, not just for shareholders, but shareholders are an important stakeholder, and profit isn't bad. Profit is not bad, and I think we have to be really mindful that when we do talk about being purpose-led organisations, that you can still make a profit and you can still create value for shareholders. But it's not just about saying that you're purpose-led and having words on a sheet of paper or on the wall. It's ensuring that your entire organisation is aligned. So you've got people's heads, hearts and hands all connected to why you exist and how that's actually going to create value for those stakeholders. So I can give you some examples later, but that would be my overarching view of enlightened self-interest.
Does anyone else want to comment on that? Or actually, I was going to ask you, Darrell. I just read Intrepid Report's integrated report this afternoon, which is fantastic, and I recommend it to you if any of you are considering doing an integrated report. And I was really struck with the fact that you articulate that alignment of purpose and profit. So do you want to tell us the story of how you got to where you are today? Because I think that begins to play out on what Leona has said, that there's much more than enlightened self-interest at play.
We're going way off script already here, just by the way. Yeah, look, happy to, except for the fact that it's not necessarily a short story, but I'll try to keep it short. Yeah, so it's a funny or an interesting conversation. I'm a tour operator who morphed out of a backpacker, and so I'm a relatively simple person. And when we talk about, have this kind of conversation, I start always at the person. And so as an individual, you might have family members or friends or whatever, and I would like to think, or we or I, treat them with a lot of respect, and you look after them and you care for them, but specifically treat them with respect. I see companies not that dissimilar. That if you have a company and you have a group of staff members and a group of customers and shareholders maybe or whatever, then if you look after those people and you care for them and treat them with respect, then it comes a certain point of time that if you need it, they'll probably look after you as well. And so yes, you might call it self-interest, but actually I just think it's common sense. As an individual, you look after those people around you, and at a certain point of time, if you need it, they'll look after you. And ditto, it happens the same with other stakeholders that a firm might have. So in terms of the journey to integrated reporting, we took that same philosophy and said, well, okay, who are our different stakeholders? Where are our different capitals, if you like, that derive value for the company, value being a multifaceted thing anyway, and how do we explore and work with those different stakeholders? So, what does it mean to be a customer of ours? How can we look after and support and nurture that customer? And if we do that well, they will return travelling with us. How do we look after the environment? How do we look after the communities that we're travelling through? How do we look after our staff members? And by starting to go through a measurement process of those, then you start to recognise where value is created in the firm.
Shall I use this, or is it not working at all? Just keep. So, can you talk? You've come from the financial services sector, Victor. So, talking about the idea of the things we've just heard, the idea that profit's not bad, but how it's generated and the social rewards that come with thinking about that broader stakeholder group, and then the sort of social disincentives that come when those other stakeholders are not considered.
Well, good job I retired 2 years ago, so I'm no longer a banker, so forgive me. Well, it really comes down, from my perspective, to the very beginning of describing why the business exists. And today we talk about purpose, and people, have tried to enunciate purpose, but far too often I've seen purpose statements, which I call martini statements. It relates to an old martini advertisement. And basically they're kind of like, we're going to do all things at all times in all places better than anybody else. A bit cynical, I know, but they're really kind of general statements. And very few of them actually say we're going to do harm to customers or any other staff or anything. So yeah, we're going to, we love our customers, we want to do great things. We love our staff, we're going to look after them, and we want to do the right thing. So challenge number one is to be really crisp in what your purpose statement is. Why does this business exist? Yeah, it's got to exist to do something good. And if you take the words of Peter Drucker, the only real purpose in a business is to do something good for customers. But I'd like to extend that, and in the businesses that was involved in and still involved in as a non-exec, essentially, we are trying to do good for customers. But most of the businesses rely on people. So you can't do good for customers if you're not doing good for your people as well, your staff, and and in fact, if you take Richard Branson will turn around and say that the number one constituent in his business is not customers, it's actually staff. So look after your staff and look after customers. But then you can extend that further and just say, okay, we've got to make sure that our customers, we do the right thing for our customers, we do the right thing for our staff, because we've got to help them as well. And if you do the right thing for them, they will look after your customers. But also, increasingly, we've got to do the right thing in society. And if we do things that harm society, then we don't have a long-term sustainable business. So conclusion is profit bad? No, it's actually good, because if you don't generate profit, customers are not going to benefit in the future, your staff aren't going to have jobs, etc. The question is, how do you generate them? Are good returns the result of doing something good?
I think that raises the fundamental issue that we want to talk about tonight, because what we heard all through the Royal Commission was a number of corporate managers saying that they were generating the profit because they were maximising shareholder value. As someone who represents a whole lot of investors, they found that very problematic to be told that they had somehow caused the unethical behaviour, because they'd certainly never asked for it. They had assumed that business would be conducted ethically and certainly legally. So can we talk about that idea that most companies, for a long time, for decades, if you'd ask boards and management what their purpose was, they'd say it's shareholder value maximisation, as if that's the only reason why they exist, which doesn't quite get to that broader view that you just articulated, Victor. So again, Leona, would you like to sort of talk to what do we mean by a broader purpose? I mean, when so many people say it's just shareholder value maximisation.
Yeah, and I think organisations that say they exist to make profit or drive good shareholder return haven't thought hard enough about why they actually really exist. And it has to go back to actual basics. So to Vaughn's point, why does this organisation exist? What is the value it is meant to create for all of its constituents, not just its shareholders? Shareholders are a very important part of the ecosystem, don't get me wrong, and getting really clear about what that means for their business, because it has to be completely related to the business that they're in. Now, once you do that, then you have to make sure that you have leaders that actually understand how to drive that through the organisation, and importantly, how to make decisions that actually line up with that purpose. And those decisions are sometimes going to be decisions that shareholders or others actually aren't going to be too happy about. Now, let me give you an example. I was really fortunate in my executive career to do some global research and trip around and see a whole lot of companies who were purpose-led. And I spoke to a lot of people about a lot of decisions that they had to make. And there's one that actually I'll share with you tonight because it sort of rings true with what we're talking about now. Now, I was meeting with the executive who was responsible for strategy at J&J, so Johnson & Johnson, and he was telling me about two things. First, he was telling me about his entry into the organisation. So he was actually brought in by acquisition, and so he was meeting with the managing director, and the managing director was talking to him all about purpose and credo. And as we know, the credo at J&J is actually the broader articulation of their purpose. And he said he left that first meeting and went back to his second meeting, and they were talking about purpose and credo again. And he said to him, listen, when are we going to start talking about the business? And the response from the MD was, mate, this is the business. He didn't use mate, that's an Australian. He said, this is the business. And it actually was a real turning point for him to understand what it meant to drive a successful business within that framework. So then he was CEO of their Nicorette business, and he was faced with an issue, faced with an important decision. They had they were issuing new packaging for their Nicorette tablets, and there was a 0.000 something % risk that children would be able to open the packaging. Now, it was a really small risk. But what he and his executive team did was looked at that against the credo and against what it was that it meant, what the purpose for J&J, and said, okay then, we're actually going to have to redo this packaging. And they said, well, hang on, it's going to cost us $1 million just to do that, let alone the delay in going to market. And he said, well, that's money well spent. Now, they're the decisions that are hard to make. They're the ones that as leaders we have to make sure that we're being really clear about, are we living our purpose? Not just when times are good and when customers are happy, but in times when we might need to invest. So ensuring our actions and our decisions and the customer experiences that we create actually line up to the purpose. And sometimes they're going to be tough decisions and not everyone's going to like them.
I'm going to move on to that idea of shareholders and investors are not homogenous, and pleasing everybody is simply not possible. One of the examples about purpose that I've read is Henry Ford, when he started making the Model T, which was about making cars affordable for everyone. He didn't go into that business because he wanted to make a profit. I mean, he did, but that wasn't his purpose. His purpose was he wanted to change how people moved in the world. And the purpose of Intrepid is you want to change how people see the world.
Not exactly. That's actually our vision.
Okay.
We want to, in terms of vision, we want to change the way people see the world in terms of, so when we take people travelling, and it's aspirational because we'll never change the world necessarily, but if we can show people another culture and get them under the skin of a place and see what's good and bad about a place and really make them think about the world and their contribution to the world, then that's what we want to do. But our purpose is actually to deliver the best travel experience ever for our clients. And there's a second part of the purpose which we only talk about internally, which is on kind of how we're going to do it, and that's to create, deliver, make, sell, market the best travel experience ever. And the reason why that's our purpose is, and we've kind of thought a fair bit about this, is that if it's something like shareholder value or profit maximisation, do you really think any staff member is going to get out of bed in the morning to say, woohoo, I'm going to deliver maximum profit today? You know, if you're working in finance or accounts, in IT or marketing or whatever, or let alone leading a trip somewhere, they're not interested in that. Most people aren't interested in that. It doesn't get them out of bed. But if you want to create the best travel experience ever, and you are one of, in our case, 3,000 odd staff in 45 odd countries around the world, and you know that you have a role in either creating, managing, designing, selling, operating the best travel experience ever, everyone in our organisation literally has a buy-in point to that purpose. And so that's why we kind of went down that path.
They're very temperamental microphones. Okay, so let's go back to that question of there's not homogenous investors or shareholders, and that idea of giving up some short-term opportunities for long-term value creation, and the fact that you could be punished by the market for doing so. So Victor, I'm going to ask you to talk about that because that is a massive challenge for leaders about how to manage that, because the short-termists in the market are noisy. They'll make their views known and they can affect your share price. So, you know, what does it mean for leaders to actually be weighing up those idea of long-term value creation might see a short-term dip?
Is that working? Yeah. My sort of most enlightened experience in dealing with investment managers when I was running a listed company in India. And it was kind of interesting to see that behaviour actually play out. The only question would be, you know, well, how are you going to get your cost-income ratio down? How are you going to get your ROE up? And my response is really easily. I'll just shut down half my business. Yeah? There's wonderful things for my cost, but it's not sustainable in the long run. So, you know, yes, if you have to rely on short-term tweaks to maintain your profit, then your fundamental business is not doing very well. And so those people that rely on it have to rely on it more and more. So I'm not sure that there is actually a difference, and I think enlightened shareholders will see that. Now, tragically, we do have, you know, some shareholders who have only one thing. We are not long-term. You know, we're investing, and we want to get out in 5 to 7 years. So I think it's also very important that businesses, and you know, I'm working with a small startup at the moment who's looking at you know, taking on investors. And the big thing I'm saying to them is be careful who you choose. Make sure that you have an alignment in value. Now, of course, if you're a large listed company, you can't always help that. But at the end of the day, what's the alternative? And I would point them in the general direction of somebody who's much wiser, much more erudite, and much more successful in business than either them or me, for sure. And that's Jack Welch, who back in 2009 said, TSR is the dumbest idea in the history of the world, or something like that.
What's TSR?
Total shareholder return, sorry. So, you know, I think if you pursue short-term profit simply to prop your share price up, it's not sustainable anyway. You know, at the end of the day, you've got to be doing the right things for the business.
Darrell, can I ask you to talk about that anecdote, because that absolutely flows on from what Victor was just saying.
Yeah, we'll assume there's a degree of Chatham House rules here, okay? Because it wasn't an off-the-record anecdote, but between 2000 and 2010, our company had a compound average growth rate of 28%. So basically over that whole 10-year period, 28% every year growth. In 2011, we took on a new shareholder from the UK, and who we did a kind of an M&A deal whereby we tripled in size overnight through acquiring a number of their companies. They took 60% of our shareholder register in the deal. They're a FTSE 100 company, so listed in the UK, 32 billion revenue, 32 billion euros revenue, in fact. So a huge company. And for the next 4 years, they were on our share register, and for the next 4 years, our business grew at exactly 0% compound average growth rate. And they were reasonable people, they were nice people, but because they were large, listed in the UK, they had certain expectations of institutional investors in particular, and they had analysts buzzing all around them, and so they became incredibly short-term focused, incredibly risk-averse, and purely financially driven. And so there's a real clash of cultures with our organisation, which wasn't especially financially driven. It's just that we got great financial outputs. We were very people-focused, we were very product-focused, and we were very long-term focused as well, and had a higher risk appetite. And so it's just a real clash of cultures. But ultimately, we saw profit as an outcome. You get all the different variables right in your equation in terms of how you deal with customers and how you deal with your staff and how you deal with other stakeholders. If you get all that right and you manage it well, you will make a profit. But it is the output. Whereas their thinking was you start with the profit and kind of fit your whole budget around it, and we just couldn't handle it. And to be honest, we just stuffed it up. We were really bad at thinking that way. And anyway, short story short, we bought them out, and that was 3.5 years ago. And almost the month we bought them out, we started growing again. And this year will be our 30th year, and we'll grow 20% again this year. And in fact, our profitability, which we don't care that much about, will grow 28%. So it's not all bad.
Well, that's a great ad for Purpose. Which leads back to the issues that you started talking about, Leona. Actions and behaviours, what can you actually do inside an organisation? Because that's the hardest thing, so that it's not just buzzwords, not just language. Can we talk about some of those things and how you link remuneration structures to it and incentives and, how you deal with people? What are the things you can do?
Wow, that's a massive topic that I'm not quite sure I'll be able to cover off in one short and succinct answer, but what I'll try and do is sort of talk about some high themes, and then I'll give you some examples. So firstly, I said before that in terms of aligning an organisation to purpose, you have to firstly make sure that you've got engagement across the organisation in the creation of the purpose, because it really has to be a joint decision. It's not just a decision of those in the executive or a select few. It really has to drive engagement, not just internally, but also engagement with your customers. So I'll leave that out there. But once you've done that, aligning people's heads, hearts and hands is actually really important. But you can't do that unless you've got a culture that actually drives that. Now, when I talk culture, what is culture? All culture is the signals and the messages that people receive around what's of value to that organisation and how you're expected to behave. And culture is actually a collection of a whole variety of things, systems and processes. So if you don't have your processes around remuneration lined up to what you're doing from a purpose perspective, then it's just not going to happen. So systems and processes, symbols and rituals, leadership and behaviour. Now, all of those things, which is essentially the whole way in which an organisation is wired, has to be aligned to where your organisation is heading. Now, if people are going to be receiving messages from all of those things that actually don't align to where you're saying you're wanting to take your organisation from a purpose perspective, people will follow what you do, not what you say. So no matter how many times you say, this is our purpose, this is what we do, this is what we stand for, and this is how we do things, if your structures and your processes aren't lined up with that, then people won't listen. So if your remuneration is all about return on equity or total shareholder return or profit, then people aren't going to actually say, okay, but we're here to do this. Well, no, actually, you're telling me we're here to make money because that's the way the remuneration structure is designed. So ensuring that those things are lined up is really important. But we can't forget about communication, because people receive messages through how we communicate as well as those other things. So ensuring that you talk constantly about purpose. So why are we here? Why do we exist? In your team meetings, in your executive meetings, hopefully in your board meetings. It's really important because that will reverberate through the entire organisation. Tell you one little story, if I can, about the importance of communications and the importance of symbols and rituals. As part of this tour that I was telling you about, I was fortunate to go and spend some time at St Jude's Children's Research Hospital. Now, this is a non-government funded hospital which provides free cancer services for children. Now, it's all fundraised and. Beg your pardon?
So it's in Tanzania.
Yeah, no, in the US.
Oh, okay.
In Tennessee, actually. So what was interesting about the time there, and you might say, oh, that's easy, they're a hospital, which is what I said to the executive team when I was meeting with them, that, well, you must find it much easier to align your organisation to your purpose because it's very real. And they said, it's funny that you should say that because it hasn't always been that way. Whilst, yes, the reason we exist is very real and has great impact. People in IT, people in finance, people in some of the administration teams actually never really connected with why we existed. So they did a whole lot of stuff to connect the entire back end of the organisation. And one of the things that they did, which I thought was really clever, at the beginning of every single meeting, whether it's a board meeting, whether it's an executive meeting, or whether it's a team meeting, they take 15 minutes, sometimes half an hour, to simply talk about a patient. And either that an individual patient or a team member's experience with a patient, to make sure that whatever decisions are made from that moment on actually are all about purpose. And if you can manage to get that in your organisations, then that is seriously gold.
Great example. Victor, do you think that there's a sort of risk that people are now looking to, particularly corporations, to sort of solve a whole lot of environmental and social issues, when in fact there's also a role for government in that? So but companies have a history of innovation. You talked about that yourself before, that, you know, your business is about actually contributing in some way to the well-being of society by having a great product or service that customers want and enjoy experiencing. So are we in danger of sort of trying to ask corporations to do more than they're capable of?
Are you suggesting that government should intervene?
No, I'm just
I'm not
asking,
so sure about that.
where's the waiting for leaders about understanding that, you know, what their role is when they're talking about being socially responsible and nimble? They're not the only player.
No, they're not the only player. I mean, government can help, but at the end of the day, I don't think government can legislate it. It goes back to, you know, what do you believe your business is about, and doing the right thing. Now, the problem is that the right thing is easy to say, but the line about what is right, is not homogenous over different, let alone organisations, let alone countries, yeah, but also changes over time. So I think what government can do is to, you know, highlight those changes and support that, but not legislate for it. But really, it's up to companies. And I think the key thing for companies is to stick very closely to their purpose. And I think Leona covered a lot of the things that I passionately believe in. You know, culture. 20 years ago, I really believed that the only differentiator in a people-based business is culture. And tragically, or not tragically, but sort of paradoxically, as technology has become more important, so has culture. You know, and particularly when we look at organizations today, how many organizations can really turn around and say, yep, we really believe in our people? Well, the question is, how do you demonstrate that? How do we really demonstrate that we really care for our customers? And I would argue that's sticking to your purpose. So a couple of examples, if I could give them. You know, I was always encouraged to outsource the call center. You know, we had one overlooking Darling Harbour, can you believe? Not cheap, right? And Sydney staff prices are higher. We now have, I say I'm no longer with ING, sorry. I had another one set up in the Central Coast. And despite that, you know, people said, why don't you do that? And I said, I'm not against outsourcing it. I'll outsource it not because it's cheaper, but if somebody can do it better for the customer. And the same with, you know, choice of product. In my time, staff used to say, we can't be a real bank unless we have a credit card. And people that know me said, that's the wrong thing to say, because I said, why do we need a credit card? Because our customers need it. Well, if you look, how many of you have a credit card? You all have credit cards? How many of you use revolving credit? Borrow on your credit card at 25% or whatever it is these days? Nobody? So what do you use your credit card for? A deferred debit card, yes? You pay it off at the end of the month, and you use it as a payment guarantee card for your car or your hotel. So why do we need a credit card? We need a deferred debit payment guarantee card. And, my view on saying we introduce a credit card because we want to make money or we want to do the right thing is the only people who are going to borrow on a revolving line of credit are twofold. Firstly, people who can't afford it, no other source of credit, right? Is that our business? Well, our purpose was to help customers get ahead in life and business. That's not helping them get ahead. Or secondly, people who didn't understand, like my son I discovered a few years ago, right? And borrowing and not understanding that what the real cost is. So that's not aligned with our purpose. So I think what you can do as a business is make sure that everything you do, the products you launch, and by the way, there's a great case study of Lion Nathan and Alco Pops and their decision to stop Alco Pops. Align what you do with your purpose, and if that extends, and as that extends into the environment and social responsibility, do the same thing also, okay?
Just add something on that, because this is a topic I feel incredibly passionate about, shared value, and most people in the room would know of Kramer and Porter's work back in 2011, where they actually put the paper together around what is shared value. And you actually, I was going to say you don't need to be purpose-led, but because you don't really, to actually create shared value, but it almost goes against my grain to say that, but you don't need to. But what you do need to do is you have to have a very clear view of what are the social problems in the communities or in the society in which you operate. And of those, keep that close. And what are the expertise, the products or the services that you actually provide within your organisation that can actually help address those social problems? And then what are the commercial opportunities that actually will fall out of that? Or importantly, what are the things that actually, the challenges that will help overcome for your customers to enable them to consume your products and services? So it's a very commercial view of actually creating a competitive strategy through helping solve social issues, and one that, if I put my IAG hat on, which is a few years ago now, one that I know organisations like IAG use all the time to create things like Insure Light, which is an affordability product for insurance, and plenty of other offerings to actually help lean into the issue around affordability. So getting organisations to think through that lens, it's a much easier sell for your executive teams and your boards, because there is actually a commercial outcome that you're aiming for, whatever that might be, but at the same time, you're managing to help solve a social problem.
I think that's a segue into your business.
Yeah, maybe. Just to go on for that, this shared value concept, if you guys aren't across it, you absolutely need to be, because more than just kind of echoing a sense of purpose for your organisation and for your staff, it actually builds competitive advantage into your business as well. And so right about now, in fact, at Harvard Business School is a 3-day course on shared value led by Kramer and Porter. And next year you guys should sign up for it because it's sensational.
Can we talk about your experience of shared value and the fact that you've just been accredited as a B Corp, and perhaps explain to those in the audience who might not know what that is?
Yeah, so a B Corp is a relatively new thing in Australia, but it's fairly well established in the US and a few other countries. But essentially, a benefits corporation is a corporation that does a couple of things, but one of the things is that it changes its articles of association, or whatever it happens to be called in that particular country, to recognise a responsibility to other stakeholders beyond the traditional fiduciary duty to shareholders. And so by doing that, it's actually sending a message to potential shareholders and others to say, we've got a bigger purpose in our life to do that. Beyond that, to become a certified B Corp, which is done by effectively like an audit organisation called B Lab, you undertake a fairly rigorous testing process to go and looks at all the different stakeholders through your supply chain, through your labour conditions, through customer engagement, shareholders, and various other forms. And there's a whole lot of points. It's in our particular case, it was particularly onerous because we've got legal entities in 35 countries, and 7 of the countries that we operate in, B Corp had never been to before, and because it's kind of there's sometimes a conflict between what they want to see and what our local regulatory requirements are in Tanzania or Ecuador or wherever it was, it took us 3.5 years to get that accreditation process. But if you're a single entity in Australia, it's probably a lot simpler than that. But certainly, it's been an extraordinarily interesting process. One of the reasons we did it was a kind of a mission lock process for our own staff. So I'm one of 2 shareholders. I was the CEO for the best part of 30 years, but I'm not anymore. And so when we knew the 2 founders at a certain point of time would kind of drift away from the company, but we wanted to ensure that we could lock in the values of the company so that there's a degree of legacy, and so that also as a shareholder but not an active executive, we would continue to see value being driven through shared value methodology, which is kind of what BCorp is all around. Anyway, we went through that process, we've got it, and we did it primarily for our staff, so that staff, because what you measure is what you get, right? And so if we measure staff engagement and client engagement and return on investment and all sorts of financial and non-financial measurements, you start to build a culture around performance to that multiple stakeholder engagement methodology. So that's why we did it. We got accredited finally about 4 months ago, and the staff have, it's another case where the staff have just lifted up a level because they kind of understand the expectation. It means that they've got something to work to and feel good about, because it's an ongoing process in that you're always trying to lift your engagement levels and your performance levels across multiple metrics, though, not just a very narrow financial one. That's important, but it's only a part of it.
And I think that's the sort of theme of the night, that it's an important metric but not the only one. And so we've had some sort of great insight from the panellists. I think now it's over to you. Manish, would you like to explain what now sort of happens?
I think we asked for some questions first, so any questions for the panel before we jump into a table discussion? And also Chris is going to identify some of the key themes that emerged, and but important for you guys to ask questions so you have some clarity around the table discussions as well. And the panelists will be around for questions during the table discussions as well. Questions? Back here.
Hi, I'm Asha Kayla. My question is around what happens when one part of the business is not aligned to the purpose and another part of the business is. So a really good example of this is Coles. And I don't know if there's anyone here from Coles today, but a few months ago banned plastic bags, big hoo-ha. Thought they were doing the right thing. Then a few weeks later, they put out mini shop. I don't know if anyone's seen these little kind of tacky plastic things. So on the one hand, they're saying, yeah, we're really good, we're banning plastic pollution. And then the other hand, they're actually sticking a load more of plastic tack out there because all of this stuff is ending up as litter on the beach and in the oceans. So for me, it just feels very disjointed, and like one part of the business is not talking to another part of the business. And I just wondered what your view is on that.
Look, it's just a pretty clear and obvious example of poor alignment, and a company with a really strong, deep culture around a set of values probably just wouldn't make that mistake. The simplistic thing. Slightly different, but we've done a few acquisitions over the years, and we find acquisitions one of the hardest things you ever do, because invariably you'll buy something in Myanmar or Vietnam or wherever it happens to be, and the first and biggest problem is you've got a cultural mismatch. Now, we can start a greenfield site in any country in the world and build a company that we're really proud of relatively quickly, albeit from a lower base. You do an acquisition and you've got that cultural problem of misalignment. And ultimately, I think culture in an organisation is so important that where it isn't right and it doesn't fit, you've just got to fix it. And sometimes that means killing it because you've just got to get it right. Otherwise, the organisation is going to become dysfunctional.
Despite our best efforts, organisations are living, breathing, that go on and on. And no matter what we think, that we do our best to align organisations, it's not easy to maintain that. And so a few years ago, one of the things that I decided to do was to get a group in from outside to start with our purpose, and go through the whole organisation to see how we align with that purpose across functions, across products, across processes, all the way through. It's actually a team led by Simon Longstaff, or Dr. Simon Longstaff, who's just done the Cricket Australia review. And what was interesting, we thought that, we were pretty good. We're aligned. The results were actually not bad, but 20% of our business did not align. And for no reason other than that over time things drift. And so from time to time I think organisations take a sense check. Now the other thing of course that happens over time is parts of the business change, and sometimes social attitudes change. Remember we talked about that line about what is right, 50 years ago smoking was fine, right? Maybe not now, I don't know. So it's always good to continue to have a sense check. And will these things happen? Yes, that's the nature of business. It's how you respond to them, okay? So if you allow misalignment to continue, that becomes the norm. And then you have a misalignment. So you've got to bring it back into line. Sometimes that means selling and cutting off businesses. Sometimes it means changing your policies, okay? I mean, the biggest thing for us was we had forgotten that we really, and all financial institutions talk about rewarding loyal customers. The reality is often new customers get a better deal. And on one of our particular products, we found exactly that. So we dropped, welcome rates for new customers and gave loyalty rates to long-standing customers who, we really wanted to keep.
Yeah, I completely agree with what my friends up here have said. The one thing that I would add is an exercise that I've done in a few organisations that I've been involved in, and that is actually get people like your customers and your people internally to tell you where you're not aligned. So look for where you are aligned, that's important, but actively seek out where you're not aligned. Not so you can punish the people who actually aren't aligned, but actually so you can use it as a broader learning exercise across the organisation. And that you then, in essence, help the organisation become self-perpetuating and fulfilling towards their purpose. So that's been a useful thing that I've seen done.
That's a great point. I'm just going to give you an example of that. We had a great pride in our call centre. And the main thing that we were looking for was a really great customer experience, and it was called a wow experience. And one day they came to us and said, look, you're measuring us wrong. You're measuring us by conversion and things like everybody did. We don't want that. Just measure us by if we've had a wow call and we've given a customer our experience, reward us for that. It's exactly what you were saying, Leona. Okay.
Any other questions? Everyone knows this stuff backwards?
No, we've got a few left.
Oh, sorry.
Hello, my name's Stephen Bartos. I want to ask a question about something that during all of this discussion has been worrying me a little bit, and that's an elephant that hasn't been addressed, and that's the role of institutional investors. It's been mentioned briefly, and we shouldn't be broad brush and simplistic. Not all institutional investors are short-term and profit-focused. However, it is the case that a large number of institutional investors are, because they're required to be by their own constitutions, that the purpose of the fund is to maximise profits, and they have a legal obligation to do that. So if you take a step back, if they're the majority investors in a company, what then does that do to the incentives on that company itself? And that seems to me to be something that is a very important issue, especially in Australia, because by a number of measures, we have the highest proportion of investment in companies by superannuation funds of any country in the world. And a lot of those superannuation funds fall precisely into the category of bodies that are required to maximise financial returns to their members. How do we deal with that?
That's a really good question, and one we didn't get to. There's a big discussion going on, of course, in the institutional investment community amongst superannuation funds about what that fiduciary duty is to maximise returns, and whether that's a short-term obligation or, in fact, a long-term obligation. And there's a lot of how the funds show their returns. They always start with a sort of 1 year, 2 year, end up with a 10, 15, 20 years, and there's a lot of discussion about actually reversing that, so you start seeing what you get over the 10, 15 year, moving back to the short term. So just changing how you view the returns. There's a lot of discussion about that questioning, whether that is a short-term obligation in law. There's been a lot of work done. Martijn Wilder from Baker McKenzie has done a lot of work around that. And the super funds themselves, of course, are very conscious that they've got liabilities to their beneficiaries, often stretching out 30 years. So for them, having a long-term view of long-term value creation is becoming increasingly important. And they, in fact, are often now the ones who are engaging with companies around saying, we'll support you around some of the short-term pressure because we want you to take that long-term value creation view. And I can certainly tell you that retail shareholders, the individual investor, those who invest directly as well as indirectly through superannuation, tend to be long-standing shareholders. They tend to be very loyal. They tend to be sticky. Now that's a conditional loyalty, but for the most part, they are planning for their retirement or they're in retirement and trying to generate an income stream. So from their perspective as well, they want it to be a long-term value creation rather than necessarily just short-term profit. So there are a lot of pressures, I agree, from the short-term market on boards and on managers, and I think it makes it extremely difficult. But the conversation in the investment world is shifting as well. And ESG, environmental, social and governance factors, have fundamentally altered the discussion in the investment world, because you cannot look at ESG without looking at it in a long-term perspective, because you're looking at the fact of the impacts of the business activity, which could in fact come back as a risk to the value of the investment, but it's a long-term horizon. So ESG started off as a sort of, little sort of niche area. It's grown. It's now being involved in investment decision-making globally across all of the major funds, and again, being driven by superannuation funds, pension funds. I think the disconnect, and we spoke about this briefly before the session, is that CEOs and CFOs, there's two streams of engagement in Australia. CFOs and CEOs meet with analysts and they've got a very short-term view, absolutely. Boards meet with the proxy advising firms or with ACSI, the Australian Council of Superannuation Investors, or with the Australian Shareholders Association, representing retail shareholders, and they are taking a long-term view. So you've got a disjunction and a disconnect between two sets of conversations that are occurring within a company with its investment community. And I think that disjunction, there's a lot more work to be done about how we're going to actually start aligning that.
I was just going to say, I think there's also a role that the business itself has to play, and that is that the CFO and the CEO have to make sure that they're utterly aligned with the board, and between those stakeholders, they need to give a message to investors as to what they are aiming to deliver to investors. And if they want to say, hey, listen, we're in the short term, you think you'll do okay? That's cool. If they say, we are in here for the long-term return, financial return, shareholder return, then that is also cool. But they should be messaging to shareholders what it is that they're trying to deliver. And, in that light, Warren Buffett, who's not a bad investor, has always made it really clear that he is a long-term investor. He is a long-term stakeholder in companies, be it through shareholding or ownership, as in whole ownership. And he wants to return over the long term 15% return on equity. He's crystal clear. In fact, he's way exceeded that over 45, 50 years, whatever it is. So it's just about messaging, I think, and it's getting that messaging and communications really crystal clear. Then you won't have a problem, because then an analyst has got nowhere to go to a certain extent.
I have a soapbox to get on for a minute, okay? I think that you can make returns in the short term, but in the long term, you've got to be doing good things for customers and staff, etc. What's been the problem, particularly in financial services? People have had alternatives, but they haven't really had choice. And more importantly, it's a question of control. You see, I used to hear when I came to Australia, people say to me that so-and-so owns the customer. And I used to say, that's crazy. I didn't know slavery was alive and well in Australia. But I was actually wrong, because it was implicit ownership. Because actually, particularly in banking, moving my relationship, moving my accounts was a pain in the neck. How many of you go home every night and dream of the power of compound interest? Banking is important, but it's deadly dull. And because of that, it didn't matter. But I think there are four factors that are actually changing the power in the relationship from the organisation to the consumer and customer, particularly in financial services. One is the democratisation of technology. Technology in the beginning was brought in to help banks, not to help customers. Today, when we had our digital app, within 6 months, over half our transactions were on digital. More importantly, if our digital app went down for 20 minutes at 2 o'clock in the morning, people noticed. My time, my place, on my terms. Number two, we've always known about the barbecue. In fact, one bank actually had an advertisement about it, okay? Today, the barbecue is 1 million people on social media, okay? So now if I do something, everybody knows about it. My reputation is there. It used to be so hard to compare products. I'm not going to walk around. Yeah, another challenge for you. How many people, I can see Sally there over, have you read a PDS lately, Sally? How many people have actually read a PDS word for word? Goodness me. Yet that's what we all had to bring in. You must be a lawyer. So apart from lawyers, who's read a PDS? So it was so difficult to compare and rate products. Guess what? Go to product review now, right? How many stars? It's so much easier. Get references not from believing some advertisement that somebody put out, but what real users have said. And the fourth thing is yet to happen. The ownership of my information. GDPR in Europe, comprehensive credit reporting, and yet to come, wait for this, everybody, open banking. It's my data. I'm not owned by anybody. I own it. I can do what I want with it. My passionate belief and hope is that those four factors will actually drive consumers to make choices and actually move from organizations because they have the power now. And what you're seeing, particularly in financial services, it's small yet, but is the rising of a lot of companies who think they can do better than large conglomerates. So I'm optimistic that actually long-term value, profit maximization, doing the right thing for customers will come because of those factors.